After weeks of opposition scrutiny and criticism, the former Governor General stepped down Friday as special rapporteur on foreign interference. The Liberals have pledged to work quickly to consult with opposition parties around and forge ahead with an investigation into foreign interference. But what will that look like without David Johnston? Dominic Lebon is the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and he joins me now. Minister, thanks for coming in.
Good evening, David.
You said you're going to consult with the opposition. What conversations have you had with the opposition parties to this point?
So I had an informal conversation with one of the opposition leaders on the weekend. I'm going to set up meetings, I hope, tomorrow or Wednesday with the other opposition leaders. We're doing our own work in terms of what would be the next steps. I'm very encouraged by what a number of them have said publicly. We think, David, the country would benefit from lowering the partisan temperature. Mr. Johnston's departure, we think, gives all of us an opportunity to work together. If we say, as we have, all of us, that protecting democratic institutions, being ready to counter the increasing threat of foreign interference is something that should concern all parliamentarians. We now have an opportunity to work together and find the next phase of the public process that will benefit, we think, from a consensus that would be in the best interest of Canadians.
You say you're encouraged by what you've heard from them, but the devil will be in the details, I guess, in terms of how you move forward. Do you need all three of the main opposition parties to be united on a path forward, or 2 out of 3 do? I mean, do you need a full consensus or just a majority?
Well, so they voted, the 3 opposition parties, in favor of asking the government to consult with them. That's exactly what we're doing. Again, I'm not going to prejudge what those conversations will be. They have said over and over again, David, that there should be a public inquiry. We have said that a public inquiry was never off the table. Mr. Johnston had recommended against one and explained why. Because, and by the way, this is exactly what Mr. Harper had concluded in a previous government in which Mr. Poilievre was a member. But there are ways that a public process, even a public inquiry, can be done responsibly that protects the national security information of Canada, that protects the lives of the men and women who work in our security agencies. A responsible government is always going to do that. But it can be done in a way that gives greater transparency to efforts to counter foreign interference, reassures people in diaspora communities that are understandably concerned. I'm not optimistic at all about our ability to find a common sense, responsible way forward. And as I say, the public comments in one private conversation and talking to a number of senior opposition MPs earlier today, I think we can hopefully find a way forward.
What is your preference at this point in time? I mean, the Prime Minister and your government kind of put all of your eggs in the special rapporteur basket, and that has now blown up as of Friday. I mean, does not a public inquiry feel like an inevitable conclusion at this point, that this, in some form, has to be the path with a judge, with subpoena power, with people sworn under oath and cross-examination?
Well, so we have always said that a public inquiry was on the table. We asked Mr. Johnston, a former Governor General appointed by Stephen Harper, long experience as a Dean of Law, to provide advice. He identified the challenges of a traditional public inquiry in this space. If you're an opposition party, you can just say, we want a full-blown independent public inquiry. That's what they've been saying. That's fine. What we're saying to them is, okay, what would be the terms of reference? What would be the timelines? Give us examples of the kind of suitable person who could lead this exercise, but have experience in intelligence and foreign interference matters, might be somebody that would enjoy, obviously, a nonpartisan credibility. There's an awful lot of common ground here. We just need to get to work quickly.
But shouldn't that be the conversation at this point? Not whether or not there should be a public inquiry, but what a public inquiry would look like. Doesn't that feel like where this is at this point in time?
But I said in the House of Commons today, David, that if the opposition continues to say they want a public inquiry, that in and of itself is not as constructive a suggestion as saying, we think there should be a public inquiry. Here's how we're going to deal with the legal obligation to protect the information.
But only the government can call a public inquiry, right? We've seen this. Parliament has voted 3 times for it, and we don't have one.
But we've said we're prepared to do so if we can have a constructive and serious conversation about how that can be done responsibly. It's something, by the way, that Mr. Harper refused to do.
Right.
And we're saying that we're willing to look at all of these options, but not in a way that's irresponsible or, frankly, if we want to attract the kind of appropriate person to step forward, or persons, because it doesn't have to be one, it could be 2 or 3 people, for example, that would lead this next stage of the public process. They will benefit from knowing that there's a consensus amongst opposition parties. They probably took note of what happened to Mr. Johnston, and they will understandably want to see that there's a consensus about how this can be done properly.
Well, define constructive and serious, because they've all said they're willing to cooperate with you, at least publicly that is what has been said, and they've all said they want to see a judge-led public inquiry. So, I mean, can we just start from there and assume, yes, it'll be a public inquiry led by a judge or judges, and then work on exactly what the terms of reference will be, or do you even have to, do you still need to be convinced that it is a public inquiry that's required?
David, we've said from the beginning that all of these options, including a public inquiry, should be considered. We accepted Mr. Johnston's suggestion that a public inquiry is difficult in this space, but there needs to be a public process as the next phase of this effort. His departure allows us to look at that again and hopefully look at it in a less partisan way, benefiting from the opposition offering constructive suggestions of how they intend to protect, how a potential inquiry could protect the national security information of Canadians, what would be the timelines, and the kind of person or persons who should lead this.
Right, so what would be the timelines for a decision on this then? Because we've lost a few months now with the Johnston process being sort of detonated. Well, at least
I don't accept, David, obviously the premise that Mr. Johnston's work was all lost.
No, but it's
and
unaccepted
by the way,
by diaspora communities. They're not happy with what he concluded. They're not happy with the work that he did. They're not happy with the process he laid out. I mean, you've seen the criticism and the pushback here.
But David, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, something we created that has members of Parliament from all political parties, is continuing their work.
When will we see their reports? Do you know, NSI COP?
I don't sit on NSI COP. You should, David McGuinty would perhaps be happy to come here and tell you that. He chairs it.
We keep asking him, but he won't. The NSI COP, I mean, because they deal with intelligence, they aren't doing interviews.
Well, he could talk to you about his time. But so our work has not stopped. The other thing that's important, David, is we're going to be introducing legislation soon around a foreign agent registry. My colleague, the Public Safety Minister, and the Justice Minister are looking at other legislative measures around the security of information, potentially declassifying information. So our work is continuing. We haven't stopped working. We think there should be a next phase of a public process, and everybody would benefit by lowering the partisan temperature. I'm encouraged that perhaps we could find a consensus, and frankly, it would be in the best interest of Canadians if we could do that.
After what happened with David Johnston, how hard do you think it will be to find a person or persons to step into this role? Because I cannot imagine the last few months have been pleasant for Mr. Johnston.
And I worry about that. I said that on the weekend. The best antidote to that concern for the kind of person or persons we would hope might participate would be to see that the political parties are working together. If ever there was an agreement between many of the political parties on the kind of person, or ideally the person or persons, the terms of reference, the timeline, it would feel a lot more secure for somebody of the caliber we'd want to participate in this process to come forward. So it behooves all of us to do that work in order to get the best possible person or persons.
So when do you want to have this done? When do you want to have consultations with the opposition wrapped up and a decision made on the next step?
I'm hoping if it's constructive and collaborative, later this week, next week, like Parliament adjourns probably in 10 or 11 days at the end of next week. Ideally, we would have come to some consensus by then, but to some extent we'll be governed by how we can get to that serious conversation, which has been lacking heretofore up to now. But I'm more optimistic today than I was last week.
Mr. Speaker, we can't wait 2.5 years for more process to unfold to get the answers we need about interference in our democracy that affects all members and all parties of this House. So, will the government commit today to a public inquiry so this democracy and Canadians across the country can get the answers they deserve about PRC interference?
All right, so what is at stake if the opposition parties don't get a public inquiry? NDP leader Jagmeet Singh joins me now. Mr. Singh, it's good to see you again. It's becoming a regular thing.
Good to see you.
I wonder, Dominic LeBlanc said that he had a casual conversation with an opposition leader about this already. Was that you? Have you spoken to Minister LeBlanc about next steps in this?
No, I haven't. But we're open to speaking to the government. Really now the ball is in the government's court. We've long said, from the beginning I've said, that a public inquiry was the right process to go forward with, restoring Canadians' confidence, asking questions, and the vigor and the rigor of cross-examination, sworn testimony, that was a proper procedure. I had a motion 2 times in Parliament calling for a public inquiry. One of those motions also included having Mr. Johnston step down because of the appearance of bias. That has now happened. We also called for PROC to begin the work of setting the terms of reference and the criteria for someone to lead a public inquiry, that work is already beginning. So we're well on the way. If the government wants to do it, they should just do it.
But Minister LeBlanc says he wants to consult with you, Mr. Blanchette, Mr. Poilievre, and come up with some sort of a consensus, maybe before Parliament rises next week, which, assuming it goes on schedule. Can you have this all hammered out in terms of a terms of reference and an agreement on what you want by the middle of next week?
Absolutely. I think it's very reasonable to do that. We know the criteria would be something similar to the Rouleau Commission. A judge, either someone that's currently serving or someone retired, someone that has not donated to a political party in a recent period of time, and someone that has no association with any of the specific allegations of this particular case of foreign interference. So that would mean no association with the Trudeau Foundation. So
who does that? Who do you have a short list of names? You must have something like this, given the number of motions you brought into Parliament. Who would you like to see lead this process?
Well, we can set up the criteria. The government's in the best position to vet people for those criteria. But what the government should do is similar to what we did at the provincial level when we select officers in the Ontario level where I served. What would happen is there would be a member of each party that would be on a committee chaired by the Speaker. The Speaker's office would go through lists of candidates, vet those candidates, and present them to the committee. And then we would look through the resumes and then make a selection unanimously.
Has your party done any work, though, on a list of names? Because you've been so adamant on this, I assume you have an idea of who you'd like to lead this process.
Well, we focus on the criteria. And the criteria is similar that, as I pointed to, the criteria for a public inquiry should be similar to what we've seen in previous successful inquiries, like the most recent one, which is the Rouleau Commission. So we point to those criteria. A judge, either currently serving or retired, someone that's not affiliated with the case in any way, so specifically no affiliation with the Trudeau Foundation, and then also someone that's got no political history in terms of donations favoring a party in the recent number of years.
Given everything, though, that happened to David Johnston, I mean, what do you think that does to the potential pool of candidates? I can't imagine it makes it broader and deeper than it was. Had Mr. Johnston been treated differently. I mean, what impact do you think that has on the capacity to find someone to lead one of these processes?
Well, I would say that the approach of the Conservative Party, the Bloc, was not appropriate. I think they were overhanded, extreme in their criticism, and they lost a lot of credibility in that approach, and I think that was not helpful. We tried to maintain a very respectful approach of appearance of bias, which was made out, and I think it is reasonable for people to look at that and say that there was an appearance of bias, and Mr. Johnston did the right thing.
But you did table a resolution calling for him to essentially be fired. I mean, so I know you weren't as personal in directing your attack as some of the others, but that's still quite a move, and I think it creates an environment that people may look at and say, why would I want to raise my hand for this job?
Well, I would blame the Prime Minister for this. This was the wrong process from the beginning to have a special rapporteur. To have a public inquiry in and of itself creates more independence, has a judge making decisions on what information should be released because of national security interests. That inherently will be a better process and will be one that we can pull from a pool of judges and retired judges as well.
So Dominic LeBlanc says he wants to start this conversation with you throughout this week and stuff, but it seems, if you listen to all the opposition parties, and they've been consistent on a public inquiry, that the table stakes for the government here is a public inquiry led by a judge, full subpoena power, witnesses under oath, and cross-examined by counsel. Like, that is the format that appears to be the bare minimum, correct?
That's what most people are pointing to. And I point to the Rouleau Commission, and that's similar to the Rouleau Commission.
So if you don't get that, what do you, I mean, if the government insists on a process that is short of a public inquiry, if they won't agree with this, even though we've gotten to this point, what do you do as their confidence supply partner?
Well, what we've been doing, and as I've said from the beginning, we keep the pressure up, and the pressure has worked. We put pressure on Mr. Johnston being removed. We tabled a motion in Parliament, and that motion had weight and had pressure. It didn't happen immediately after, but there's certainly power to the majority of the parliamentarians of the House of Commons saying we no longer have trust in Mr. Johnston continuing. I'm sure that contributed to Mr. Johnston's decision to resign. Our pressure to call for a public inquiry seems to have finally worked. Now we've got the government that's initially said no, completely off the table, is now open to it. So we continue to apply the pressure like we've done in many other cases before. And on this one, we've been the leading party calling for a public inquiry from the beginning. We forced 2 votes on this. And now we're at this point where it looks like it's going to happen. I'm going to continue the pressure.
But do you think the political environment in this town right now between all of the parties is such that anybody is going to step forward and volunteer for this job without deep reluctance after what we've just seen?
Well, I think a public inquiry is very different from a special rapporteur. I say if the question was, would a special rapporteur step forward? No, absolutely not.
And that wouldn't be acceptable to you anyway, right?
It wouldn't be acceptable anyways. But a public inquiry is something that is very different. The independence of a public inquiry, the nature of it is something that I don't think there's any barrier for someone someone that's qualified for that to come forward. I think it's absolutely possible, but I have to make it really clear. It is now fully in the government's court. They have now signaled openness to doing it. If they're serious about it, they should do it. I'm more than willing to work to make it happen.
Okay, I want to bring in Richard Fadden now. He's a former CSIS director and a former National Security and Intelligence Advisor, and you've been with us throughout this story for the last couple of months. Where do you think we are now with David Johnston's resignation? I mean, the issue of dealing with foreign interference and dealing with the reach of China, where does this leave the country?
Well, I think it leaves us in a highly undesirable spot. Compared to our allies, we're not doing very well. I've talked to a few old friends who work in this area. The allies are wondering what's going on. I would think that Beijing and Moscow are quite happy about all of the discord that we're generating. I agree with Mr. LeBlanc in one respect, at least. Mr. Johnston's departure does afford an opportunity for a restart.
Do you think he had to go? Do you think he could stay and push through it, as he seemed to suggest on Tuesday when he was here, a week ago when he was here, but then by Friday he was gone?
No, I don't think so. I thought it might be a possibility until his appearance before the parliamentary committee, and the negative pushback after that was so great, he could have technically stayed on. I think he would have had very, very little credibility.
You say Beijing and Moscow are loving this. How does this serve their purposes, do you think?
Well, anything that sows discord within democracies, it allows them to argue around the world that democracies are not doing so well. It's one of their main themes. They love what's happening to some degree in the United States with Donald Trump and whatnot. And it proves, from their perspective, that their system, an autocratic system, is more effective in general governance and developing the economy, and we're contributing to that view.
What do you make of the timeline that we see now? Minister LeBlanc says he hopes to have a consensus of all the political parties before Parliament rises by the middle of next week. Do you think that's achievable?
Well, I'm a sort of a glass half full sort of guy, but it would need to be a fairly large glass, I think. I hope they can do it. I think they would have a greater chance of achieving that if they have, say, 3. I think that would allow some balance between competing interests.
Like a 3-person panel leading the inquiry, or whatever it is?
Whatever the heck it is, yeah. Sort of a chair and 2 people. The chair being, beyond reproach. Maybe somebody who has a little bit of national security experience, and maybe somebody who has either electoral law experience or interest in the diaspora and whatnot, to balance out a little bit. Whereas if we're expecting these 4 parties to agree on one individual when they have virtually agreed on very little over the course of the last little while, I think it's asking rather a lot.
You've served in public life. You served in high public office. I mean, what do you think what we've seen over the last couple of weeks does to that pool of potential candidates and the willingness of people to step into this? Because, Dominic LeBlanc describes it as a snowblower that David Johnston went through. I've compared it to a wood chipper. Neither one of those things are pleasant.
No, I think Madame Normandin, your previous panelist, was right. I think if they can agree on 1 or 2 or 3 people and on the mandate, and either directly or indirectly agree to lower the blood pressure, then I think it will be possible to find somebody. But I don't think we should delude ourselves. Given what Johnston's gone through, and given the hyperbole that at least 1, if not 2 of the parties use quite frequently, this is not going to be an easy job.
Hyperbole in what sense? About the risks of foreign interference, or about the individuals and their character? About
individuals, their characters, about what the government is or isn't doing, and about foreign interference. Everything seems to be exaggerated to the point where the core issue of foreign interference sort of gets lost in the mishmash.
So how do we get the focus back on that, right? Because that's where all of this started, was allegedly deep concerns about the state of our elections and the involvement of a foreign state in the outcome, and it's spiraled into a bunch of different things. If they do get this consensus by next week, what do you want to see them attack, and how quickly do they need to get at it?
Well, I would argue that an ideal arrangement would be for the commission, I'll call it a commission, I don't know what it will be. They have a 6-month mandate to come up with very concrete recommendations relating to, in particular, Chinese interference, but something by the end of the year, so that Parliament could deal with the issue by the end of the year, the very beginning of the next year. Then I would give them another year to look at foreign interference, not just Chinese, not just electoral, but very, very broadly. We need to come to grips with the issue, not just with people like Mr. Chung being threatened, with other people having their electoral prospects affected, but there's the diaspora, there's the use of ethnic media, there's poking and prodding at provincial and municipal levels. If we don't take advantage of this opportunity, and I do think it's an opportunity to look at it broadly, I think we'll miss a real opportunity. But I would give them the 6 months that we have left in this year and tell them unambiguously, People have been thinking about this in the public service, the think tanks, the universities. There are all sorts of recommendations. Come up with a set of 8 or 9 or 10 very concrete things that the government can do by Christmas.
So essentially a two-step process. One, to really copper fasten the
Yes.
election integrity of the country.
Yes.
And then do that broader look at pressure tactics and everything that we've heard the diaspora community and activists
Yeah,
talk about.
including talking to our allies and what they've been subject to, because I think in the final analysis, we would do well to admit there's no silver bullet here. You know, we're not going to solve this by a commission or whatever. The only way this is really going to succeed is if all of our allies and ourselves start pushing back on China and others, start drawing red lines in the sand, not a good way of putting it, but, you know, drawing a clear barrier beyond which we're not prepared to tolerate it. And if people cross that barrier, you either declare them persona non grata if they're diplomats. If they are not, I would argue we should make foreign interference a crime, which it is not in Canada. It's just something that's a bad thing. And if we catch people at it, we charge them criminally. And we do a variety of things. We reduce the size of their embassies and their consulates. We close them if we have to, although I don't think that's a particularly desirable thing to do. But there are a whole bunch of things that people who work in this area could come up with. But we have to take action on this issue. Talking about it is not going to get us anywhere, I would argue. And of late, there's been a great deal of chat.
There sure has. And I wonder, when you look at that, and when you look at the political dynamic and everything that has happened, does it feel to you like the root issue is being taken seriously enough by the Parliament of Canada?
I do not. I think that this has been a problem for the last decade at least. If these leaks hadn't been reported by Chase and Fife, we would not be having this conversation. The government may have been, you know, motoring along under the radar screen, but would Mr. Mendocino have brought forward the Foreign Agents Registry without all of this? I don't think so. I don't think it's central to their considerations. And as I think you and I have talked about before, Canadians generally don't feel threatened, and governments know this. So while concerns about foreign interference has increased over the last little while, I don't think it's shifted the current government's real preoccupation, I think, with social policy. I mean, every government has a focus of one sort or the other, and I don't think I'm being unkind when I say that Mr. Trudeau's government's focus is not national security or foreign affairs or defense. So I don't think they are taking it seriously enough. And, you know, we have a tradition in Canada. Sometimes it takes a crisis to move the file.
But do you think it's just the government not taking it that seriously, or where do you think
It's
the
everybody.
opposition?
It's everybody. It's everybody. I mean, there are no votes in national security, to be very blunt, and politicians, not being fools, realize this. But I think, you know, much like after 9/11 or when we were in Afghanistan, if there's a real crisis, and if we can agree this is a crisis, I think the political rhetoric will become calmer and everybody will agree that we need to do something concrete.